Before my grandmother died, she would often claim that Frank Sinatra performed at her high school when she was a student there. Now, my grandmother was a pretty honest person, and I don't think that she would lie about something like this. But memory can be fickle, and I wanted to see if I could find any evidence that this performance actually happened. Frank Sinatra was born in 1915 in Hoboken, New Jersey. My grandmother was born about 15 years later in Belleville, New Jersey. Now, Belleville and Hoboken are pretty close, only about a 35-minute drive. Sinatra was also the child of Italian immigrants, and my grandmother was of the same heritage, so this is a distinct possibility that something like this could have happened. But again, I wanted concrete evidence. So the story was always that Sinatra came to my grandmother's high school and sang a couple songs. She also said that her brothers and sister were there. For that to be the case, this alleged performance would have had to take place between September 1941 and June 1943. I won't give you the whole backstory on Sinatra, but he started to get more famous in the early 1940s before really blowing up in December 1942. And actually, that performance was on December 30th, 1942. So I feel like if he were to perform at a high school, it would have to be before December 1942. I decided to reach out to some Sinatra experts to see if there was any evidence that he performed at Belleville High School during this period. First I spoke to was David Morrell. Morrell is best known for writing the book that the movie Rambo was based off of, but he also wrote a short volume about Frank Sinatra. Morrell's email did not make me feel good. He basically said that it's possible but highly unlikely that Sinatra would have performed at a high school at this time. Again, like I said, my grandmother not really a liar, so I don't think she was making something up, but maybe she was misremembering. I decided to give my grandmother's sister a call, who's the last living person who would have been alive for this. And she affirmed to me this 100% happened. She remembers the performance. Okay, two people saying the same thing is good, and my grandmother's brothers also would tell the same story, but still I want some concrete proof beyond just memories. So I decided to map every Sinatra performance in New Jersey in those months that I mentioned earlier. Again, there are none in my grandmother's hometown of Belleville, but there are some in Newark, which is a mere 18 minutes away. Maybe he had a performance and then someone called in a favor and he showed up at a high school and sang a couple songs. So I started digging through newspaper archives to try to find any evidence of this performance. And I find some of him performing at other high schools in the region, but none at my grandmother's high school. That's when I get another email from a Sinatra biographer. His name is Richard Moody. Like the other writer, David Morrell, Moody sort of tells me the same thing. This could have possibly happened, but it does not seem likely based on the timeline. So now I'm a couple weeks into this, and there are two competing theories. There are the Sinatra experts, the writers, the people that have studied his life telling me this probably didn't happen, and there are my relatives telling me this 100% happened. But that second writer, Richard Moody, does give me a piece of advice. He says, why don't you reach out to the high school? So I reach out to the current principal of my grandmother's high school, and he tells me he has never heard of Sinatra performing at the high school. Needless to say, this is not good for this quest. You would think if a world-famous singer performed at a high school, it would be something that was enshrined somewhere. But again, I really don't think my grandmother would make this up, so I continue to dig through newspaper archives for weeks and weeks. And I find tons of articles about Sinatra performing around this time. I also find news articles about his youth. But then I find one that feels like a breakthrough. Tommy Dorsey's vocalist at Nutley Assembly. Around this time, Frank Sinatra sang with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. So that headline is referring to Frank Sinatra. And it's referring specifically to the fact that Sinatra performed at Nutley High School at the time. Now, Nutley High School is only 9 minutes from where my grandmother grew up. That is very, very close. Maybe my grandmother was at that performance for some reason and was remembering that. So then I start going to look through the yearbooks of my grandmother's neighboring town, Nutley. And despite the fact that this news article says that Sinatra performed at Nutley High School, there is no mention of it in any of the yearbooks. To me, that struck me as super strange. But for good measure, I looked through every yearbook from my grandmother's high school between 1940 and 1960, also looking for mentions of Sinatra. And again, this turns up absolutely nothing. Again, how could one of the most famous people of the 20th century perform at a high school? We have evidence of it from my grandmother's neighboring high school. We have no evidence of it at my grandmother's high school. And it is not mentioned in a yearbook. This feels absolutely ludicrous to me. Right around this time, I'm talking to my mother's cousin, and he tells me in the version of the story his father would tell, this girl named Jean Cox got Frank Sinatra's autograph after he performed at Belleville High School. So I go on Facebook to try to find this woman, and I soon learn that she passed away in the 1990s, but her children are still alive. And when I ask her children if they'd heard of Frank Sinatra performing at Belleville High School, they tell me their mother never mentioned this. You've got to understand, this is really, really weird. Why, if Frank Sinatra performed at your high school and you supposedly got his autograph, would you never mention it to your children? I'm about 2 months into the search at this point, and I'm starting to grapple with the fact that Maybe my grandmother just made this up, not intentionally, but maybe she conflated memories. I don't know. Then something strikes me. I remember the article about Frank Sinatra performing at my grandmother's neighboring high school, Nutley. Tommy Dorsey's vocalist at Nutley Assembly. So I go to a defunct newspaper that was popular in my grandmother's town in the 1940s. And rather than searching for Frank Sinatra, I decide to search for Tommy Dorsey. And that's when I find it. High school students hear Frank Sinatra, Dorsey singer. My grandmother was not lying. Frank Sinatra did perform at her high school, and there is newspaper evidence of it from the time. The reason that I could not find this for months is that the newspaper misspelt his name. Again, this might strike you as strange. How do you misspell Frank Sinatra's name? He's one of the most famous entertainers and celebrities of the 20th century. But you've got to remember, at this time, he was really just starting his career. Nobody knew what he was going to go on to, so a typo, it was not that crazy. And actually, if you look through newspaper archives from the early 1940s, you see this typo come up again and again. Sinatra is spelled Sonatra. And that's the story about how I proved that Frank Sinatra performed at my grandmother's high school while she was a student there. If you enjoy the stuff that I post here, consider clicking the link on my profile to pre-order a copy of my forthcoming book, Uncharted Territory: What Numbers Tell Us About the Biggest Hit Songs and Ourselves. It's packed with crazy musical stories just like this one.